I remember very well when President Bill Clinton announced the normalization of diplomatic relations between the two countries, the U.S. and Vietnam. In fact, I was in Hanoi at that time, and some other Americans who were here, and I talked about this idea that in the next 1 or 2 days, we thought President Clinton would make this announcement. Well, that's what we were hearing from Washington. And we said, let's get together. Let's have a place for Americans and Vietnamese friends to gather and to at least to watch this event on TV. And we found a place, a new bar on Bao Cainh Street called the Polite Pub. And that night, so many people came and watched President Clinton announce that after so many years, now Vietnam and the U.S. were normalizing diplomatic relations. And everybody in the bar cheered and they shouted and had toasts and drank beer. And the next day, in the newspapers all over the world were pictures of Americans and Vietnamese celebrating in Hanoi, celebrating the normalization of relations between the two countries. And now we've just observed the 25th anniversary of that event.
Thực ra thì chúng ta đã cố gắng gác lại quá khứ, đã phải phấn đấu hết sức để làm thế nào phía Mỹ họ gác lại quá khứ hoặc là họ vượt qua quá khứ. Bởi vì lúc tôi ở đó ấy, thì lúc nào trong đầu người dân Mỹ cũng nói là Việt Nam là cuộc chiến tranh. Và nếu là cuộc chiến tranh ấy, thì chúng tôi hận người Việt Nam. Chúng tôi không tin người Việt Nam và chúng tôi không thể bỏ qua cho người Việt Nam. Chúng tôi tin là người Việt Nam vẫn còn giam giữ tù binh Mỹ.
A quarter of a century ago, hardly anyone could have imagined how Vietnam and the United States could have overcome the pain of a devastating war to build the strong and constructive relationship that we now enjoy today.
Today, I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam.
In this historic picture, behind the 42nd President of the United States, are two gentlemen named John. At that moment, they shared the belief that it was time for the United States and Vietnam to set aside the past and look forward to the future, despite the deep gulf of separation that the war in Vietnam had created in past decades. These are two of the many bipartisan congressional representatives who helped to strengthen U.S.-Vietnam bilateral ties through many administrations, regardless of the standing president's party. But these individuals did not work alone. The normalization of diplomatic ties between our two countries was the result of hard work and the vision of many people on both sides who believed in the possibility of peace, so that in the end, the voice of normalizing U.S.-Vietnam relations has become the leading voice. It is the effort with both hearts and minds, silently and openly, persistently and consistently, of those who broke the ice of the history. The first and most obvious light in which the sea presents itself from the political and social point of view is that of a great highway, or better, perhaps, of a wide common over which men may pass in all directions, but on which some well-worn paths show that controlling reasons have led them to choose certain lines of travel rather than others. These lines of travel are called trade routes, and the reasons which have determined them are to be sought in the history of the world.
2 centuries ago, during the early days of the United States, we reached across the seas for partners in trade. And one of the first nations we encountered was Vietnam.
In 2000, a significant bilateral trade agreement was signed by Vietnam and the United States. Looking back 2 centuries ago, this seemed impossible for 2 nations separated by thousands of miles and located on distant continents.
Almost 200 years ago, at the beginning of the relations between the United States and Vietnam, our 2 nations made many attempts to negotiate a treaty of commerce, sort of like the trade agreement that we signed today. But 200 years ago, they all failed, and no treaty was concluded. Listen to what one historian said about what happened 200 years ago, and think how many times it could have been said in the 2 centuries since. He said, these efforts failed because 2 distant cultures were talking past each other, and the importance of each to the other was insufficient to overcome these barriers.
The first lesson that I learned after Vietnam was no more Vietnams. That was it.
We cannot change the past. What we can change is the future. More than 100 years ago, the patriotic young man, Nguyen Thanh Thanh, later President Ho Chi Minh, began his journey to find a way to liberate the Vietnamese people, in which he came to Boston, where the Revolution of Independence in the United States started. During World War II, Vietnam and the United States were allies on the anti-fascist front. Viet Minh, led by President Ho Chi Minh, helped the U.S. pilots shot down by Japan in Vietnam. And again in the historic days of the Vietnam August 1945 revolution. The only foreigners with President Ho Chi Minh were U.S. friends.
Cho dù chỉ có một lực lượng nhỏ bé của đơn vị con nai thôi, nhưng điều quan trọng là chúng ta xác lập chỗ đứng của mình là đứng về phía đồng minh chống chủ nghĩa phát xít, có nghĩa là người chiến thắng trong cuộc đại chiến.
The 1945 Declaration of Independence of a New Vietnam began by quoting the United States Declaration of Independence. As a coincidence of history, the birth year of President Ho Chi Minh, Vietnamese hero of national liberation, was also the year in which Alfred Thayer Mahan published his timeless and earth-shattering analysis of the United States, entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan's views influenced not only the development of naval warfare theory, but also the development of foreign policy and maritime doctrine in the United States. Mahan believed that the U.S. economy would soon be unable to absorb the massive amounts of goods being produced domestically. Therefore, he argued that the United States should seek new markets abroad, and the U.S. government should guarantee access to these new markets. Securing such access would require a merchant navy to carry American products to new markets, while the safety and security of open lines of communications must be ensured.
Why should America care about the maritime disputes of foreign nations half a world away? There are certainly economic reasons for remaining engaged. The South China Sea region is an important source of jobs and natural resources that benefit many Americans. However, perhaps the larger consideration is the strategic one. The world's geopolitical center of gravity is shifting to the Asia-Pacific region, a region in which many states are rising at once in wealth and power. This creates friction between them where old disputes remain unresolved. The United States has a national security interest in maintaining a favorable strategic balance in this vital region. And central to that is defending the universal freedom of navigation and open access to the seas as a foundational principle of the international order.
Security and freedom can only be guaranteed by our independence from any colonial power and our free cooperation with all other powers. It is with this firm conviction that we request of the United States, as guardians and champions of world justice, to take a decisive step in support of our independence. Right after the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, one of the first countries President Ho Chi Minh wanted to establish friendly relations with was the United States. He sent 14 letters to U.S. leaders, including President Truman, requesting the establishment of a comprehensive partnership with the United States. Unfortunately, there are historic opportunities that have been missed, and the two countries have experienced periods of traumatic ups and downs.
Tại sao đang ở những cái thời kỳ tốt đẹp như thế mà cuối cùng lại rơi vào một cuộc chiến tranh và thù địch đến nửa thế kỷ tiếp theo? Đấy là bài học rất lớn.
In order to understand how the United States became involved in the Vietnam War by 1965, you have to understand what drove U.S. Foreign policy in the post-1945 era. And that was one of containment, meaning to contain Soviet power and the spread of communism abroad. And the second is this notion of credibility. No U.S. president wanted to lose a country in Asia as Truman lost China. And so in that way, no president after Truman, be it Eisenhower, be it Kennedy, be it Johnson, wanted to be the president who would lose Vietnam to communism on his watch.
We of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, who participated in the decisions on Vietnam, acted according to what we thought were the principles and the traditions of this nation. We made our decisions in the light of those values. Yet we were wrong. I believe we were terribly wrong. And I believe, therefore, we owe it to future generations to explain why.
Paris, September 3rd, 1783. The U.S. negotiating delegation, led by prominent American figures such as John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, through direct negotiations with United Kingdom of Great Britain, signed the Treaty of Paris, 1783, under which the United Kingdom of Great Britain formally recognized American independence. Exactly 190 years later, and also in Paris, the people of Vietnam, with a desire for independence, freedom, and reunification, reached an agreement to end the war.
This moment in Washington and Hanoi. At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc-Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
Article 1 of the agreement states that the United States and all other countries respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam.
The Vietnamese had fought for 50 years, not to make a compromise, but to unify their country.
In 1973, of the nearly 600 American prisoners of war who returned to the U.S. under the Paris Peace Accords, there was a remarkable figure who would later become a respected U.S. Senator, and with a great vision inherited from a family of naval officers, that person stepped onto the ship of destiny and became one of the most vocal proponents and advocating for the normalization of U.S.-Vietnam relations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the war had not yet ended after 1975, and Vietnam was caught up in a decade of conflict and economic difficulties. The leaders of the unified Vietnam were then struggling to find a way to lift the embargo.
Chúng ta thấy là xây dựng đất nước đàng hoàng hơn, to đẹp hơn, thì người ta nói tới vấn đề kinh tế, người ta nói với kỹ thuật, công nghệ, người ta nói tới một cái trình độ phát triển cao. Thế rồi sánh vai với các cường quốc Nam châu thì thực ra là phải làm bạn được với các nước lớn. Và nước lớn đây là những nước mà thường là cựu thù, là những nước mà gọi là đã đối đầu với Việt Nam trong cuộc kháng chiến. Tức là phải làm bạn, phải thiết lập được quan hệ. Nếu nó không nói là quan hệ bình thường mà là phải quan hệ rất là chặt chẽ với những cái nước đã từng là cựu thù, thì tôi nghĩ rằng là một cái rất là khó đối với Việt Nam.
A week before ordering the evacuation of all Americans from Saigon, the 38th President of the United States, Gerald Ford, in a 26-minute speech at Tulane University, declared the Vietnam War was finished as far as America is concerned, and called on the American people to change their focus from Vietnam to other future issues. But in fact, for the community of families whose loved ones were missing during the Vietnam War as POW MIA and the veterans, they were still trapped in the deep pit of a war that had lasted for 2 decades. Ever since the last American POW returned after the 1973 Paris Agreement, the United States has been tormented by and obsessed with the question, who else is left behind?
The Vietnamese families lost so many more than the Americans did. There's just no comparison. The difference is our people were lost in a foreign country. The people in Vietnam who lost their family members, they lost them in their own country. So it wasn't that they had to go to the United States to try to find out so much as we were dependent upon.
Ms. Ann Mills Griffiths works in a special working group that helps with national policy making on POW MIA-related issues. She was the only member who did not work for the government, but who had access to confidential information, even at a higher level than the permission routinely granted of members of Congress. The life of Ann Mills Griffiths changed forever when her brother, James Mills, a naval radar intercept officer who operated an F-4 fighter jet, went missing while on a mission in North Vietnam in 1966.
In my family's case, we never expected that we would get any remains recovered on my brother because he was flying off the USS Coral Sea in a Phantom F-4 going over the coast of a hostile country at that time and disappeared off of radar. So nobody knew where he was. Nobody saw anything. There was absolutely nothing to go on other than the route into the country. And so it was totally a mystery.
After that incident in the following years, Ann's family helped form the nucleus of the League of Families in California. In the League's early years, she and other members fought for credibility. Griffiths remembers picketing the White House, the United Nations, lobbying Congress, and working with the media to keep the initially unpopular POW issue alive. Just before Christmas 1976, the U.S. government tried to close the book on the entire issue. A House panel determined that there are no more Americans living in captivity in Indochina. This is said to have shattered the last ray of hope for many families. They even considered that conclusion to be an insult. However, Things changed after Ronald Reagan became president, who was previously the governor of California, the origin of the National League of POW, MIA families.
Well, today, I want you to know that your vigil is over. Your government is attentive, and intelligence assets of the United States are fully focused on this issue.
Under President Ronald Reagan's administration, the issue of resolving the fate of the missing U.S. soldiers became the nation's top priority. In addition to promoting a public awareness campaign, the White House increased additional resources for the POW-MIA issue and actively pursued the POW-MIA issue in negotiations with Vietnam.
We had to find common ground and common interests. Unfortunately, the list to select from was very, very small. It is my view that the POW-MIA issue, even though it was controversial, served as the first good test of our two countries working together.
If it weren't for pioneers like the late Foreign Minister Win Kotak, he was truly a pioneer, and he was a visionary. And the people with President Reagan, who's the one who raised the priority and took the risks on the American side, and people like Rich Armitage, Richard Childress, Paul Wolfowitz, people that were willing to go and engage in this very difficult early on discussions to build a reciprocal process of humanitarian cooperation. And it really is a guide to the world of what you can do if you're willing to set aside political and policy differences and focus on what you have in common to work together on, and step by step, and it's taken a long time.
In 1987, President Ronald Reagan appointed retired General John William Vesey as the president's special envoy. This is an important milestone in the process of solving POW-MIA issues. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Vesey, was also a veteran of the Vietnam War. During the 7 years from July 1987 to April 1993, through 3 presidential terms, General Vesey took on an extremely difficult role and became one of the historic Icebreakers. When working directly with Vietnamese partners, General Vesey had repeatedly witnessed Vietnam's incredible patience. After many efforts, he had only received vague signals about the outcome of the goal of normalization. At that time, General Vesey, who did not hold the political key to the problem, could only say, "Let's imagine the United States and Vietnam are on a boat traveling across the English Channel between England and France. Although the fog keeps us from seeing the British shore, we are close to reaching the land. So don't jump into the sea."
Tôi nhớ là năm 88, khi mà Việt Nam đã thực hiện một cái chương trình 2 năm về tìm kiếm người mất tích từ năm 86, 87. Và đến năm 88 thì Việt Nam hy vọng là với cái cố gắng của mình trong 2 năm đó thì Mỹ sẽ có những cái chuyển gì đó trong quan hệ. Nhưng mà đến cuối năm 88 ấy, thì Mỹ vẫn không đáp ứng được những yêu cầu của Việt Nam. Mà lúc đó cái yêu cầu cụ thể của chúng ta ấy, là muốn lập một cái phòng quyền lợi hay cái gì đó để theo dõi vấn đề Mia, nhưng phía Mỹ cũng không chấp nhận. Thế và lúc đó thì chúng ta có một cái quyết định là ngừng hợp tác với Mia. Thế và lúc đó thì ông McCain đã ngay lập tức ngày hôm sau đã liên lạc với Việt Nam và nói chúng tôi đang cố gắng, chúng tôi đang tạo dư luận, mà các ông làm cái này như là một cái cơn bão đó đến, nó đập tan tất cả các thứ. Để mong là các ông cố gắng cho. Thì lúc đó chúng ta mới lại hồi lại và tiếp tục.
In 1989, in the context of hostility and procedural deadlock over the MIA issue. A 35-member U.S. medical volunteer team traveled to Hanoi to treat Vietnamese children with cleft lips and palates. This was the largest group of Americans to return to Vietnam since the 1975 evacuation campaign. The trip had received unofficial support from General John Vesey and the U.S. government.
Extremely happy. I talked with Washington just before we left, and they told us that they're very, very pleased with the work that Operation Smile has been doing and the tremendous progress that we've made in this accountability.
I'm very glad I came. I'm very glad because I know that the people that we've met are not our enemy.
In Hanoi, meanwhile, Dr. Ninh Huy Phan of Military Hospital 108 was chosen to connect with the U.S. doctors. His work was not merely limited to surgeries, but more importantly, to promote informal diplomacy, or people-to-people diplomacy. Because of this sensitive work, the talented doctor was once mistaken for a spy, and the one who exonerated him was none other than the General President, Le Duc Anh. Normalizing relationships is an arduous and demanding journey. At the most critical moment of the matter, the individual's role becomes more important than ever. In early 1989, when Vietnam announced it would withdraw all troops in Cambodia in September 1989, the U.S. Department of State agreed that one of the most prominent diplomatic icons in the decades-long conflict in Indochina, Ambassador William H. Sullivan, would return to Hanoi. The trip took place in May 1989. During the trip, Mr. Sullivan had the opportunity to meet his old acquaintance, Vice Chairman of the Council of Ministers and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam, Nguyen So Thach. If before they had sat face to face in secret and intense negotiations in Paris, this time they were destined to negotiate together concerning the matter of normalizing U.S.-Vietnam relations.
He asked if I could do two things for him. One was to, through the International Center, bring middle-level bureaucrats from Vietnam's foreign ministry to the United States to learn how our system functioned, particularly the role of the United States Congress, which is still not fully understood in Vietnam. Secondly, he asked if we could set up a U.S.-Vietnam Trade Council. This was back in the time of the Bush administration, but we got permission from the White House and State and Treasury to do these things.
So we had a wonderful 3 days talking about what these two men might be able to do to build a new future. Not forgetting about the past, but to begin to chart a path to build a new chapter in our relationship.
If POW MIA is a historical issue of special significance to the American people, then the Cambodian issue is a contemporary issue and strategically important for the United States engagement with the region. Although the two countries had not normalized their relations, in reality, the need for U.S.-Vietnam cooperation had arisen, from the issue of overcoming the war's consequences to solving regional security issues on the basis of international law in the interest of regional peace and stability.
Vietnam's decision to withdraw its volunteer troops from Cambodia would be a huge step in allowing Vietnam to reintegrate into the world community.
Chính từ đó giúp Campuchia thì Mỹ sẽ quan hệ ngoại giao, tất cả các nước sẽ quan hệ ngoại giao, càng biết rõ Việt Nam hơn, càng thấy rõ Việt Nam là luôn luôn muốn hòa bình, hữu nghị và Việt Nam không muốn gây chiến một nước nào cả.
On October 23rd, 1991, the Cambodian peace agreement was signed between 19 countries and 4 Cambodian factions in Paris. The New York Times, October 24th, 1991. In return for Hanoi's support of the Cambodian peace, the United States announced plans today to seek a gradual normalization of its relations with Vietnam. On August 2nd, 1991, the U.S. Senate passed a bill, Senate Resolution 82, to set up a special committee on the POW-MIA issue. From the 16th to the 21st of November 1992, the committee sent a second delegation, led by Senator John Kerry, to Vietnam. During that trip, the Vietnamese side created conditions for the U.S. delegation to verify the doubts surrounding the MIA issue, including very unusual requests that the guests themselves found extremely challenging.
I had to go into the chairperson, the chairman of the Communist Party and the president of the nation and persuade them to allow me and another senator to go down underneath the tomb of Ho Chi Minh because there was intelligence information that there were tunnels under there and there was a possibility that people were being held. And you can imagine what it was like to sit with the chairman of the party with a big bust of Ho above you, and I'm telling him, I gotta go down and check out whether there's anybody underneath Ho.
In December 1992, the United States Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs came to the conclusion that there was no evidence that the missing Americans were still living in Indochina. The road of normalization, which was thought to be wide open, was shaken by more shocking information. A 6-page report in Russian entitled The Report of Deputy Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Chen Van-Quang, dated September 15, 1972, stated that at that time, 1,205 American prisoners of war were captured on battlefield in Indochina. The figures given in the disparity report are very large compared to previously released figures at the time American prisoners were returned in 1973.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
On January 20th, 1993, President Bill Clinton officially became the 42nd resident of the White House and the next person responsible for moving the United States into the final phase of the normalization process. Leadership in Vietnam had hoped that this would be done under George Bush Sr.'s administration, but in the end it was not possible. For Vietnam, the Doi Moi had been implemented for only 5 years. Although this new economic policy achieved many positive results, the international integration still remained difficult to achieve due to the U.S. embargo. One of the immediate obstacles that Vietnam wanted to solve was how to access the capital through International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank.
Now, remember, there was a full embargo on at that time. So it was really to put together an organization that could begin working on how we would establish economic relations and working to lift the trade embargo. That was certainly our #1 task. The business community played a very important role. They worked with Vietnam on how Vietnam's reform and opening might work. They pledged to help with workshops and other information. And then in Washington, they testified in Congress. They said Vietnam was interested and ready for businesses. They trusted that if they came to Vietnam, it would be a good environment.
The Clinton administration was committed to promoting commercial globalization and the expansion of high-tech companies and multinational corporations. The United States, in the spirit of being the only superpower, quickly seized the opportunity to enter the global market. In this respect, U.S. companies also wanted to access the Vietnamese market freely. but the POW MIA issue remained a major obstacle to the Clinton administration. The New York Times, April 16th, 1993. The president stressed today that he wanted the fullest possible accounting and said that only when we have that can we even consider any changes in our policy toward Vietnam. Vietnamese officials are hoping that the U.S. will ease its trade embargo, or more important, not try to block new loans from the International Monetary Fund. For 2 days, from April 19th to April 20th, 1993, General John Vesey returned to Vietnam as a special envoy for President Clinton. The most important task of the trip was to clarify information about the Russian language document. Immediately after returning to the United States, General John Vesey had a special press conference to make public the contents he had received from his trip.
Well, I also met with General Quang Van Tran, as I told you, and I'll tell you what Quang said, and you can make your own judgments on the thing. Quang said, surely your intelligence knows I was not the Deputy Chief of Staff at that time. I was the B-4 Front Commander. I was not in Hanoi on the 15th of September, 1972. And not only was I not there on that date, I wasn't there on any other date in 1972. I was in a big fight for the entire year. And I got to Hanoi, the only time I got to Hanoi in 1972 was the 18th to the 20th of, between the 18th and 20th of December 1972. I remember it well because you bombed the daylights out of Hanoi when I came into the hospital there.
Gần đây nhất là cái buổi mà dự tổng kết bao nhiêu 40 năm văn phòng Nghĩa đó. Hôm nay ông Kerry có đến, thì tôi có hỏi ông, thế cái tài liệu Nga mà nó phá như thế thì ông thấy thế nào? Ông bảo, ông có biết không, tôi phải 3 lần đi Nga gặp ông Primakov để giải cái tài liệu đó là tài liệu giả, mới giải được.
And as we all know, that healing took a while, and it didn't come easy for either side. It was a painstaking process that required a lot of hard work, a certain amount of courage, and some compromise. And we all know that there could have been no progress without resolving the great unanswered questions at the time surrounding the possibility of missing Americans left behind in Southeast Asia. We also knew that those of us who had set out to build a new relationship were tempting the emotions of opposition of many people in both countries. Into that cacophonous cauldron, John McCain and I were thrown together. Some were suspicious of both of us, but together we found common ground.
John McCain and nearly 600 other prisoners of war returned home in early 1973, but the fate of more than 2,000 Americans missing as a result of the Vietnam War continues to haunt families in the United States. The New York Times, January 28, 1994. In a strong bipartisan vote intended to make it easier for President Clinton to end decades of rancor with a former enemy, the Senate voted today to urge that the trade embargo against Vietnam be lifted soon. The White House had supported the measure behind the scenes. A consensus emerged among senior administration officials last month to lift the embargo, but they decided that action would be put off to take political soundings around the country and determine how much backlash there would be.
Cái việc mà bình thường hóa quan hệ Việt-Mỹ là rất khó khăn ở nước Mỹ. Và để mà đứng được đằng sau ông Clinton để mà tuyên bố bình thường hóa quan hệ thì trước đó là phải 6 tháng, 1 năm, ông McCain và ông John Kerry đã phải làm việc với từng thượng nghị sĩ một để có được cái sự ủng hộ 2/3 thì mới qua được cái luật đấy. Và cái luật đấy thì mới trở lại với Tổng thống và Tổng thống mới có thể tuyên bố.
On February 3rd, 1994, U.S. President Bill Clinton announced the end of a 19-year trade embargo against Vietnam.
And the reason was, it was plenty. Vietnam was going to become, as it was clear to the senators, an important player in Asia, that it would enhance and increase America's security and economic interests in the region. And just internally, it would allow for Americans to finally move past that war.
Today, I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam.
Quyết định này phù hợp với xu thế phát triển hiện nay của tình hình quốc tế, góp phần tích cực vào sự nghiệp hòa bình, ổn định và phát triển ở Đông Nam Á cũng như trên thế giới.
From the beginning of this administration, any improvement in relationships between America and Vietnam has depended upon making progress on the issue of Americans who were missing in action or held as prisoners of war.
At the end of 2018, Vietnam and the United States jointly coordinated the 30th anniversary of a joint operation to search for missing U.S. soldiers during the war. More than 16,000 days have passed. The two sides never rest. Many American and Vietnamese expert groups have worked together in different types of terrain, some places still being covered with toxic chemicals and unexploded ordnance. They've examined the soil in the search to find remains through the use of rudimentary tools to the use of the latest cutting-edge technology. Both countries have shared millions of pages of documents to track down remains and help inform families about what happened to their missing loved ones.
The people of Vietnam, the government of Vietnam, and to the ones in the United States who, like me, many of them thought it was never possible. Well, I'm a living witness. And a lot of people are saying, well, you've worked so hard for 40 years.
Today, Vietnam and the United States have pledged to work together in finding the missing of both sides, assist the disabled, minimize the number of unexploded ordnance and explosives, and take significant steps in dioxin removal efforts.
Like the MIA and UXO issues before it, Agent Orange evolved from a subject of anger and resentment to one of cooperation and appreciation.
On August 1st, 2018, the U.S. Senate passed the National Defense Authorization Act for the 2019 fiscal year and was named after the chairman of the Senate Military Commission Committee, Senator John McCain, as a token of recognition for his contributions. However, there is another significant thing to mention when talking about the John McCain Defense Bill, which is the unprecedented budget flow. Section 1052, authority to transfer funds for Bien Hoa dioxin cleanup.
Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ đã có một cái hợp tác rất tốt trong cái dự án tẩy độc ở sân bay Đà Nẵng. Và nó đòi hỏi công nghệ cao, nó đòi hỏi số tiền lớn, và nó đòi hỏi thời gian xử lý rất dài. Và chúng ta đã thành công trong cái đó và được hoàn tất vào cái dịp trước cái dịp Tổng thống Mỹ đến sân bay Đà Nẵng năm 2017. Thế thì cái dự án Biên Hòa nó còn lớn gấp nhiều lần như vậy, nó chứng tỏ rằng là hai bên tiếp tục cam kết cả về ý chí chính trị lẫn cam kết cả về vật chất để tẩy độc và khắc phục cái hậu quả chiến tranh ở Việt Nam.
Cái khắc phục hậu quả chiến tranh đó không chỉ là giúp Việt Nam khắc phục, mà Việt Nam cũng giúp Mỹ khắc phục cái hậu quả, cái hội chứng chiến tranh mà rất nhiều người Mỹ đã mắc phải sau khi rút chân ra khỏi Việt Nam.
Chiến tranh thường để lại những cái hố sâu. Có hai cách chúng ta làm. Một cách là chúng ta đào thêm cái hố sâu ấy để thêm sự cách biệt, thêm sự hận thù. Hai là ta khỏa lấp nó đi thành mặt bằng bằng sự quên lãng. Chúng tôi cho rằng cả hai cái đó đều không đúng. Cách quan trọng nhất là chúng ta hãy vẫn để nguyên vẹn cái lịch sử ấy, cái ký ức ấy như những bài học sâu sắc. và chúng ta cùng nỗ lực hai phía xây cái bức cầu vượt qua cái hố sâu ấy.
Oh, this is great. Rain. Fantastic. Look at that. 50 years ago, we were fighting here in an attempt to destroy this bridge. I'm deeply moved that here today, 50 years later, we have veterans who are building bridges between our two great countries and peoples. It's deeply moving and meaningful to me, and I thank you all and commend you all for it.
We cannot escape the fact the war was a disaster for generations of Vietnamese and Americans. Each of us who have lived through that period have our own memories, our own emotions, our own opinions. For me, there can be no excusing the folly of that war, nor diminishing the immense destruction and suffering that it caused. But we can all be proud of the way our two countries have worked to overcome that tragic legacy. And there's so many in this room who have contributed to that effort. We've come a long way. We have further to go, and we'll go there together.
When the normalization of difficult relations has gone down in history, U.S.-Vietnam cooperative activities to overcome the consequences of war have achieved great milestones and continue to grow. Now is the time for our two nations and the upcoming generations to look further, broader, and deeper, instead of being satisfied with these successes.
Chúng ta đã cùng nhau xua tan bóng đen của quá khứ để cùng nhau đón nhận ánh sáng của tương lai. Hợp tác đang rạng lên, đó là tương lai của mối quan hệ bình đẳng, tôn trọng lẫn nhau và hợp tác cùng có lợi.
Với chuyến thăm chính thức của Chủ tịch nước Trần Đại Quang tới Hoa Kỳ năm 2013, thì quan hệ giữa Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ đã nâng lên được thành quan hệ đối tác toàn diện trên nhiều lĩnh vực khác nhau, về chính trị, ngoại giao, về an ninh quốc phòng, về thương mại, đầu tư và giải quyết những vấn đề nhân đạo.
Sang một giai đoạn mới, chúng ta cần phải dựa trên cái lợi ích song trùng, khai thác tối đa cái lợi ích song trùng cả về song phương và trên những vấn đề quốc tế và khu vực. Cái thứ hai nữa, xây dựng những cái mạng lưới bạn bè mới, thế hệ mới để tiếp nối được những cái di sản đã có.
Today, our economic ties are one of the most important pillars of our comprehensive partnership. A bilateral trade agreement took more than 2 centuries to establish, but it has shown rapid development after just 2 decades of implementation.
Today, an opening Vietnamese economy is one of the fastest growing economies on earth. It has already increased more than 30 times over, and the Vietnamese students rank among the best students in the world. And that is very impressive.
Currently, nearly 30,000 young Vietnamese citizens are pursuing education at all levels, all across the United States. The number of Vietnamese students in the United States ranked 6th in the world and was the highest among ASEAN countries. The number of American tourists who come to Vietnam to stimulate our tourism industry, learn about our culture, and enjoy our scenic touristic attractions is also approaching 1 million. These are concrete and vivid examples in the field of people-to-people exchanges between our two countries.
Dù bình thường hóa rồi, nhưng làm sao mở rộng các mặt hợp tác của Việt Nam ra. Thế thì nó có những cái câu chuyện về hợp tác kinh tế, nó có câu chuyện về hợp tác chính trị an ninh, nó có câu chuyện về hợp tác lĩnh vực khoa học kỹ thuật, và trong đó nó có cả những cái đối thoại về sự khác biệt. 2015 khi có chuyến thăm đầu tiên của Tổng Bí thư Đảng Cộng sản Việt Nam sang thăm Hoa Kỳ, thì trong cái tuyên bố tầm nhìn giữa hai nước vào cái lúc đó, cái điều quan trọng nhất là thể hiện cái sự tôn trọng thể chế, khẳng định cái sự tôn trọng thể chế chính trị của nhau.
The differences between the two countries are objective reality and indispensable in a diverse world in which peoples have the right to seek and choose their own development path. But the reality of 25 years also shows that our two countries can share many similar interests, and the differences cannot become obstacles for the development of the ties of mutual friendship and cooperation that bind Vietnam and the United States together.
I strongly believe that we have very solid foundation for the further cooperation in many generations to come. A foreign scholar once claimed war was Vietnam's destiny, but I did not believe that. The people of Vietnam must break free from their supposed destiny and reach forward with all our might, peace, prosperity, and a better future.
More than a century ago, Mahan realized that commerce thrives by peace and suffers by war. Therefore, peace is the first and foremost benefit of all great maritime nations. We live in a world where security and economic growth are intimately linked, and the risk to peace is the danger to prosperity. Today, the Asia-Pacific region faces both complex traditional and non-traditional security challenges, which require active cooperation from countries, including Vietnam and the United States. In order for peace, stability, cooperation, and development in the Asia-Pacific region to thrive, freedom and safety of navigation must be secured.
Với tinh thần gác lại quá khứ, vượt qua khác biệt, phát huy tương đồng, hướng tới tương lai, và thái độ đối thoại chân thành, thẳng thắn, xây dựng, đây chính là điều đã làm nên tính chất khác biệt và đặc biệt của quan hệ hai nước chúng ta so với nhiều mối quan hệ song phương khác. Và nhiều người đã bình luận quan hệ Hoa Kỳ và Việt Nam là một mẫu mực của cố gắng vượt lên quá khứ để nhìn về tương lai.
In a country where many Americans and Vietnamese lost their lives in a very bloody war. Today we are no longer enemies. We are friends.
If the relationship between Vietnam and the United States is a long-running film through the centuries, after many incidents throughout the course of history, punctuated by traumatic events, then the two countries seem to be on the right track, toward a happy ending with a promising and bright future. The future generations of our two nations will always be trusted partners and friends.